All right, so let's jump right into it. Lots to unpack today. Starting off, we've got Russian President Vladimir Putin and his response to Ukraine's proposed 30-day ceasefire. You know, the one that came out after those talks with the U.S. Well, Putin says he supports the idea, but yeah, but there's a catch. He's throwing in a bunch of questions
Yeah.
and what he calls nuances.
Yeah, that's what really jumps out at me. It's not a straight up no, but all these conditions he's adding, well, it feels like a way to block any actual progress.
Exactly. And unsurprisingly, Ukrainian President Zelensky is calling it out,
Hmm.
calling Putin's response manipulative. He's also pushing for even more sanctions against Russia. Not that the U.S. hasn't already piled on some more, hitting their oil, gas, and banking sectors.
Yeah, I think Zelensky's strong reaction just shows how little trust there is between the two sides right now.
Mhm.
And his push for more sanctions, I mean, it suggests Ukraine still sees economic pressure as their main weapon against Russia.
So what's Putin hung up on? Well, he's specifically questioning the status of Russia's Kursk region, how those 30 days would actually be used, and who'd be in charge of controlling and policing that massive 2,000-kilometer front line. And just a reminder, Ukraine did make that incursion to Kursk a while back.
Right, and those are some pretty big hurdles, both practically and strategically. Putin bringing up Kursk. It signals that Russia's really worried about their own border security. And those questions about the 30 days, I'd say it reflects a suspicion that Ukraine might use that pause to, well, rearm and regroup.
So where do they stand right now? Ukraine wants a quick ceasefire, stop the fighting first and then get into those long-term settlement talks. Russia, they want a single deal that covers every single issue all at once. And both sides seem pretty confident they could squeeze the other into giving in.
That's really the crux of it, isn't it? That fundamental difference in how they see the path to a solution. Ukraine's priority is stopping the violence, like right now. But Russia, pushing for this all-encompassing agreement, it suggests they want things settled on their terms before any kind of lasting peace can even begin.
Now, former U.S. President Trump, he's weighed in too. He's made it clear he wants a quick end to the fighting. He even said he's willing to meet with Putin, hoping Russia will do the right thing and agree to the truce. But remember, he also mentioned before about discussing land and other final agreement stuff with Ukraine.
Yeah, and Trump wanting a fast resolution, it tracks with what he's said publicly all along. But him mentioning those land discussions with Ukraine, it raises some red flags, honestly. Could mean potential concessions, maybe even long-term consequences for Ukraine's sovereignty. And his whole optimistic take on Putin, well, it feels a bit out of touch with what's actually happening on the ground right now.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Over in Poland, President Duda is back at it, calling on the U.S. to station nuclear weapons in Poland. His reasoning. He says it's needed to deter Russia, given their aggression and the fact that they've deployed tactical nukes in Belarus.
This just highlights how anxious Poland is about their security right now, given everything Russia's doing. Duda's argument, it boils down to beefing up NATO's defenses along that eastern border.
Meanwhile, there's a development in southern Africa. Leaders there have announced they're pulling their troops out of eastern DR Congo. They were there supporting the government against those M23 rebels. This comes after the M23 made some advances, taking Goma and Bukavu. Plus, South Africa was getting some flack for sending troops in the first place. Now there's talk of peace talks happening in Angola.
Pulling those troops out, that's a pretty big change in the region's security landscape. The M23's gains just show how unstable things are in eastern Congo, and with southern African forces leaving, the government's in a weaker spot. Those talks in Angola, well, they could be a chance to calm things down. We'll have to see.
All right, moving on to Syria. Interim President Ahmed al-Sharaa has signed a temporary constitution, setting the stage for a 5-year transition period after Bashar al-Assad's ousting. This declaration covers some key stuff: Islam's role in lawmaking, the separation of powers, and guaranteed freedoms. But there's pushback. The Kurdish-led administration isn't happy with it, and there are worries about revenge killings happening. Getting this temporary constitution in place is a big step for Syria's transition. But those objections from the Kurds and the fear of revenge killings just shows how fragile and volatile things are there. It's going to be a tough road to build a stable future that includes everyone.
Trade tensions are heating up. President Trump's now threatening a 200% tariff on alcohol coming from the EU. Why? Well, the EU is planning to slap tariffs on U.S. whiskey. This whole thing goes back to those U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. And there are concerns this could spiral into a full-blown trade war, especially since when Trump did this tariff thing before, whiskey sales took a hit. This latest threat just shows how tense things are between the U.S. and the EU on trade, and the potential fallout for European winemakers. They're major exporters, so it could be huge. The whole whiskey tariff situation from before, it just goes to show that these moves can hurt businesses and consumers on both sides.
Let's switch gears to a pretty dramatic story. There was a train hijacking in Pakistan's Balochistan province, the group behind it. The Balochistan Liberation Army, or BLA, they bombed the tracks and then the siege lasted for over 30 hours. The BLA demanded the release of political prisoners, and there were reports that they killed hostages, including security forces and civilians. But the details are still fuzzy, with conflicting reports on how many casualties there were.
This whole thing just highlights the insurgency that's been going on in Balochistan and how far the BLA is willing to go to get what they want. The confusion about the casualties, it's tough to get solid info in that kind of chaotic situation.
Shifting to Italy. Overnight, there was a 4.4 magnitude earthquake that hit Naples. People rushed outside, and there were reports of some damage to buildings. Now, this happened in the Campi Flegrei volcanic basin, an area that's been seeing more of what's called bradyseism, which is basically ground deformation. But experts say there's no sign of an eruption happening anytime soon.
It's understandable that people in Naples are pretty freaked out after that earthquake. The fact that it happened in Campi Flegrei, with its history of volcanoes and now this increased ground movement, it makes every tremor scary, even if the experts say an eruption's not on the horizon.
Okay, some news from Germany now. German media are reporting that back in 2020, their Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, thought there was an 80 to 90% chance that COVID-19 actually started from an accidental lab leak in China. They apparently based this on signs that risky experiments are being done there. Of course, China's denied this whole thing from the start, and the WHO said a lab leak was extremely unlikely. But then you've got the US CIA, who's now saying they think the lab origin is more likely.
With all these different takes from intelligence agencies, it's clear there's no consensus, no smoking gun on where COVID-19 actually came from. This report from the BND just adds another layer to this really sensitive issue.
Now to a disturbing story from the US. A woman's been arrested, accused of keeping her stepson captive for, get this, 20 years. He managed to escape by setting his room on fire. The authorities are talking about severe abuse, starvation, inhumane treatment. They found him in really bad shape, emaciated. And the stepmother, she's denying everything.
This is just a horrifying case of alleged abuse and neglect that went on for years. The details coming out are just awful. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in court.
There are some investigations going on that are linked to possible corruption in the European Parliament, raids in Belgium and Portugal, and an arrest in France. The focus is on whether lobbyists from Huawei, the tech company, bribed current or former MEPs. Huawei's denying any involvement, and some offices in the European Parliament have been sealed off while they investigate.
It sounds like they're taking these corruption allegations really seriously. The fact that Huawei is involved just makes it even bigger, raising questions about how lobbying works in the EU and whether everyone's playing by the rules.
Okay, this is a bit of a strange one. There's a hot pot chain in China that's offering compensation to over 4,000 customers. Why? Well, 2 teenagers were caught on camera peeing into the shared hot pot broth at one of their branches in Shanghai. The companies apologized, they're doing a deep clean, and they're giving everyone refunds and extra compensation.
Yeah, that's pretty gross. No surprise people are grossed out. The company going this far to make amends shows they're not messing around. They don't want this to wreck their reputation.
All right, things are getting tense with the Iran nuclear situation. The original deal's set to expire later this year, and Iran's closer than ever to being able to build a nuke. It's a long story, the deal, it falling apart after the U.S. pulled out, Iran ramping up their uranium enrichment, a whole lot of diplomacy going on. The International Atomic Energy Agency is worried, and there's a chance those snapback sanctions could come back into play.
With the clock ticking on that nuclear deal and Iran making progress on their uranium enrichment, it's a really risky situation. The world's got a tough choice to make. How do they stop Iran from getting nukes? There are diplomatic options, and then there are the not-so-diplomatic ones.
We've also got some voices from the front lines in Ukraine. Injured soldiers at a military hospital, they're pretty skeptical about this whole ceasefire idea.
Yeah.
They're talking about the brutality of the war, especially the drones, how they don't trust Putin one bit, and how all these peace talks feel like they're happening in some other universe.
Yeah.
They also brought up that lost territory in Kursk and how important it is for the U.S. to keep sending them military aid.
Those soldiers' words are a powerful reminder of the reality on the ground, which is a world away from all these diplomatic efforts. Their distrust and the fact that the fighting's still so intense just shows how difficult it's going to be to create a lasting peace in Ukraine.
And finally, let's head over to Zimbabwe. A veteran politician, they call him Bombshell, He's come out and publicly slammed President Mnangagwa, even called for him to step down. This has stirred up talk of a power struggle within the ruling ZANU-PF party. And this is happening while there's speculation that Mnangagwa might try to run for a third term, something Catholic bishops have criticized. All this is set against a backdrop of economic woes and a divided opposition.
That criticism from someone like Bombshell shows there are cracks in the ruling party, some real political maneuvering going on, Mnangagwa going for a third term. It's definitely a hot-button issue, and with all the economic problems Zimbabwe's facing, things are pretty tense.
Wrapping things up with some tech news, U.S. tech companies are feeling the pinch from President Trump's latest round of tariffs on Chinese goods. And there's talk he might hit Canada and Mexico with tariffs too. For companies like Austere, who rely on Chinese manufacturing, that's a tough time. And it looks like consumers are going to end up paying more. Plus, there's a chance other countries will retaliate with tariffs of their own.
Trump bringing back and expanding these tariffs is creating some major problems for U.S. tech firms. They're so reliant on global supply chains, especially from China, that these tariffs are going to hike up costs for them, and those costs will probably trickle down to consumers. And don't forget the risk of a trade war, with other countries hitting back with their own tariffs.
And that brings us to South Africa, where things are, well, let's just say they're in uncharted territory right now. The coalition government is deeply divided over the budget, specifically a proposed VAT hike. It's a total stalemate. The ANC needs other parties to get the budget passed, but the DA won't budge unless there are some serious reforms. This whole thing could make the coalition fall apart, and people are pointing out that a VAT increase is going to hit the poorest the hardest, especially with the economic struggles South Africa is already facing.
This budget standoff just shows how tricky it is to govern when you've got all these different parties in a coalition. The clash over the VAT increase, it exposes those fundamental differences in their priorities, and yeah, it could be the thing that brings the whole coalition down.